In this section, we'll look at events from the summer of 1941 outside of the German attack on the Soviet Union and look at how things unfolded until December 7th, 1941 at D-Day. As the Germans finally broke their 1939 non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, the United States, at the same time, continued to move to help the British. And by the summer of 1941, American planes were escorting British convoys. In September 1941, FDR issued a shoot-on-sight order for German U-boats. Now keep in mind that all of this was before the war, which was kind of amazing, a shoot-on-sight order. By the summer of 1941, FDR was in constant contact with British Prime Minister Churchill, talking on secure lines. They finally agreed to have a secret meeting off the coast of Newfoundland in August 1941. It was the famous Atlantic Charter. It was gutsy for Churchill to cross the Atlantic to meet with FDR, who had come up the East Coast on a boat. And they met, and they basically agreed on what the post-war world should look like. It basically was a Wilsonian vision of self-determination of people, free trade, and so forth. It was significant in two ways. The Atlantic Charter was important in two ways. Britain, in trying to win American allies, trying to America as allies, basically agreed to give up her vast colonial empire. After all, if the Atlantic Charter is going to endorse self-determination as the Americans wanted, it meant that the British couldn't have any more colonies. Perhaps the British realized that the age of colonization had passed, or simply they were just so desperate to survive themselves as a nation, they were willing to give it up to get American aid. But I think more importantly was the United States, keep in mind, wasn't officially at war. And since Britain was at war, and it was a statement of what the post-war world should look like, Britain was stating what it was fighting for. And America was, in a sense, in the Atlantic Charter, saying that it agreed with Britain in what the post-war world should look like. It was like saying, we agree that in what you're fighting for, we support you, we want you to win, if you see what I mean. I guess it was obvious from all the actions America had taken, but America had never really come out and formally endorsed one side or the other. So it was another step away from nonpartisanship and towards active involvement in the war. In October 1941, the Germans torpedoed the USS Kearney, killing 11 men and injuring 22. The Kearney survived and served throughout the war. But a few weeks later, another U-boat torpedoed and sank the USS Reuben James, killing all but 45 of its 160-man crew. Again, this is in October 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before America entered the war. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, the situation in Europe looked bleak. The Axis powers controlled everything from the English Channel to the Lights of Moscow, as I said earlier. They controlled much of North Africa and were threatening Egypt and the Suez Canal. On the other side of the globe, by the end of 1941, things were looking pretty bright for Japan. Japan had virtual control of all the Western Pacific, with the notable exceptions of Hong Kong, Australia, and the American protectorate of the Philippines. When in late 1941, FDR signaled his intentions to embargo Japan's oil supplies, basically use U.S. naval forces to block trading of oil to Japan, the Japanese had quite the predicament. Cutting off of oil, as FDR threatened, was considered an act of war, and Japan either had to say, okay, we're going to stop our aggression, which again, from their standpoint, was going really well, or they could maybe attack the Americans in a surprise attack. A sudden surprise attack would wipe out the U.S. Pacific Fleet in its center in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and thus it would interfere with America's ability to communicate and control the Philippines and the Pacific Rim. I don't think Japanese thought that they could conquer or occupy the United States. That'd be kind of crazy. But just as America would enter the war, it would first be concerned with Europe, not the Pacific Rim. In the end, Japan thought maybe they could reach negotiations to leave Japan dominant in the Eastern Rim nations of Asia. The Pearl Harbor attack was planned by Admiral Yamamoto. He'd been educated and trained at Harvard, and he realized that if you attacked the Pacific Fleet directly at its main port in Hawaii, that would be destroying the fleet and would leave, as I say, America unable to protect the Philippines. This was better than, say, attacking the Philippines directly because most of the Pacific Fleet was settled in Hawaii. Amazingly, the U.S. had cracked the Japanese secret code and knew that they were probably going to attack. The Americans just didn't know when or where. Many assumed that they were setting to attack the Philippines, which was placed on high alert. But stupidly, I think, they didn't place Hawaii on high alert. And the fact that Pearl Harbor was so unprepared really helped spawn conspiracy theories. FDR knew of the attack, and he realized that if it was a surprise attack, he'd rally Americans into war. But there's absolutely no evidence of this, and no serious historian thinks it's the case. The surprise nature of the attack did really tick off the United States, though. The Japanese launched from aircraft carriers waves of torpedo bombers and dive bombers who struck at Pearl Harbor, which again was home of the Pacific Fleet. They first took out the airfields, of course, especially the large field at Hickam Field outside Pearl Harbor. Actually, almost no American planes got into the air. The Japanese also had small submarines in the harbor as well. The attack destroyed or disabled 19 ships and included were 5 battleships. One of the battleships was the Arizona, who was trying to escape the harbor and was sunk. And rather than dig it up, they made it into a memorial you can see here today, sort of a tomb for the sailors on board. Also, the Japanese sank 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers, and they destroyed approximately 350 aircraft. The total dead for the Americans was over 2,400, and many of them were just sleeping in their bunks. It was a Sunday morning, after all. The Japanese suffered only a few aircraft down, and it was just a huge victory for the Japanese. I should add that on the same day, December 7th, smaller Japanese attacks took place in the Philippines, Malaya, and Hong Kong, and all apparently successful. It was the beginning of a drive the Japanese hoped to take over Australia and New Zealand. The next day, FDR asked Congress for a declaration of war. It was a famous quote. He's been a day that will live in infamy, he said of December 7th, 1941. The vote for war was almost unanimous. Only Jeannette Rankin of Montana, yes, that was the first woman in the Senate, voted no because she was a pacifist. Looking back, what few recognized at the time was that the attack had not sunk the important Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers, who happened to be out of the harbor. It was lucky, not any type of conspiracy theory. This was key because modern warfare was in the air, and one small airplane could sink a huge ship. In the end, as we'll see, this proved crucial in the American victory. Yamamoto was reputedly to have said as the Japanese torpedo bombers returned after Pearl Harbor, quote, "I'm afraid that we've woken a sleeping giant," unquote, aware that the aircraft carriers had not been included. In any event, the Americans were outraged in a way they'd not been in World War I, and they were much more united and ready to fight. Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. in the next few days, and the U.S. Reciprocated. Hitler called the U.S., quote, half Judaized and other half nigrified when he declared war. This concludes the section from the summer of 1941 until Pearl Harbor.